Analysis of the story of an hour. Summary. In this story, we are introduced to this woman named Mrs. Mahler, and she has a very frail heart. And she's going to receive this very terrible news about her husband's death from a train accident from her own sister and Mr. Mallet's best friend Richard. Uh, when Mrs. Mallet gets this news, she's of course mourning a bit, but then when she leaves and goes into a room to herself and thinks about it a bit, she's overcome with joy, a feeling of victory. Right until she walks down the stairs with her sister, where she sees her husband, Mr. Mallet, walking in the door, where she then falls to the ground and dies of a heart disease. If we look at the genre of this story, this is a short story, which goes under the category fiction. And if we look at the subgenre, this is melodrama, and that is because in melodrama we typically see these kinds of emotional conflicts between something going on in the story. And in this story, we have this emotional conflict by Mrs. Mallet, who sits in this room and thinks about her husband's death and what she's going to do now that he's finally dead. If we look at the setting of this story, everything in this story takes part in Mallet's family's house. In the start, you could say that we're not really told that but this story takes place in spring, and we're in the Mallet house, Mallet family's house, where Mrs. Mallet is probably sitting down in the living room or somewhere close to the entrance, right until she goes upstairs, where she stays in the room in a chair by herself until she comes down again. The location of this house is in a town, but by them living in the town, this doesn't mean that they're middle class or upper class. This could just mean there is some kind of upper middle class. And this story takes place over the course of an hour. And then if we look at the narrator slash point of view in this short story, in the short story we have this omniscient third person narrator. And by this it means that the narrator functions as an observer. He just tells the story from the sideline without participating. And since he's just this, observer, he doesn't. It's really hard for the third person narrator as third person narrator, for the reader to identify with the persons in the text. But this is where the thing about the narrator being omniscient, where he can go and look at the thoughts of the people, characters in the text. And this can be seen on page 1, line 9 to 10, where the narrator goes in and where the story says, "She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept once with sudden wild abandonment into her sister's arms." And here it can be seen that the narrator refers to the main character as she, which means he's not there, he's just observing it. And the narrator knows that she hasn't heard these things, which indicates that the narrator knows something about her past or her thoughts. Then we have characterization. And this is where the main character is Mrs. Mallet, which we hear of her troubles in her life, and we come to realize that she's a very unhappy woman. But But then when her husband dies and she finally gets this freedom or of some sort, she begins to become more happy. Uh, and she begins to see this light at the end of a tunnel, right until she goes down the stairs and sees Mrs. Mallet being there. See Mr. Mallet there, and then dies because she can't be happy with him being alive. Then we have Mr. Mallet, and he is an important puzzle piece to this story because in the early start we're told that he's dead, but then he ends up alive and without a scratch from the train injury. We really don't know much about him except that he's both surprised about his wife's death and he never spoke badly about it. And then we have this subordinate characters, Mrs. Mallet's sister and Richard, which is Mr. Mallet's good friend, and they're just there to bring on the news about Mr. Mallet's death to Mrs. Mallet. If we look at between the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Mallet, they don't really have a bad relationship as such. They're doing pretty good, and there's not on the outside. There's nothing wrong with it. And if you asked Mr. Mallet if there was anything wrong with it, he would say no, and so would Mrs. Mallet also. But Mrs. Mallet is not happy about their relationship. She just don't say it. Then we have the conflict. And there's no real conflict between the characters. It's mostly an inner conflict between an inner conflict for Mrs. Mallet, because she never really felt happy in her marriage with Mr. Mallet. She's just this woman who is in his life, probably married away to him, and without her really loving him, and she can never really be happy in this marriage. And when he dies, she has this discussion inside her head and thoughts about, am I going to be happy now that he's gone, or will I just end up being me and still be unhappy? And when she have this thought right up until she thinks, oh, it's a good thing he died, she begins to show this happiness. Then when she walks down and she sees her husband, she realizes that she's going to have to return to her normal life, and that shock ends up killing her. But the conflict about in this is still the inner conflict from Mrs. Mallet about her husband and her relationship. Then the ending of the story is the plot twist. This is where Mrs. Mallet dies, and she finally accepts his death and thinks that she's going to move past it. But then when she sees him and she sees that he's alive and she has to return to her old life, she dies of it. That's where the ending quote of the story is, because the doctor says she died of a heart disease of joy that kills, because everybody thinks that she died of happiness from seeing her husband again, but she really died of seeing him and being shocked that she has to return to her old lifestyle, which she didn't like, in the unhappy marriage, which she didn't want to be in. Then there's the theme of the story. The theme is unhappy love, because back in the days, it was not uncommon for women to be forced married to men that they really didn't love, and this could have happened to Mrs. Mallet. But even though we know this, it's also stated in the text that Mrs. Mallet, the narrator actually said on page 2, line 49 to 50, and yet she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for? And here's stated that she actually sometimes loved him. But for the most part, she didn't really love him and just was there and felt like they really didn't match and that they couldn't be together. Um, and then later in the text, she starts think we get told by narrator that she had the thought about her life with him was going to be a long one, and that she wouldn't die in the near future. Um, and then when she's finally happy about his death and sees the good things about it, she thinks that her life now may become a long one, no, a short one, because she's going to have so much fun and be happy about it. And then we have perspectivation message. If you could perspectivate this too, um, story about the man and the mannequin, where the man is happy living with a mannequin as his partner, right up until he thinks that his butler cheated. He had sex with the mannequin, and he then ended up destroying AK, what he thinks killed her. And here is happy love for him right up until he kills her, which could relate to her here not being happy at any point. She's unhappy all the time about their love. Um, and by her being unhappy, she basically wants her husband dead, right up until the point where when he finally dies, she thinks she's happy. Yeah. And the message from all of this is that you should not get caught up in unhappiness. You shouldn't be trapped. If you're feeling unhappy, then you shouldn't be forced to stay. You should be free to do what makes you happy. Leave if that's what you want to. And you shouldn't stay in a relationship where you ain't happy. You can do whatever finally just by leaving. Yeah, that was my analysis of the story of an hour.